Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carlos Vargas Ramos. I am the Center for Puerto Rican Studies Director of Public Policy Development and Media and External Relations. Welcome, everybody, this afternoon to this webinar, Post Disaster Recovery in Puerto Rico and Local Participation. This is part of a series of webinars we have been conducting at Centro, looking at the impact that the several crises that have affected and afflicted Puerto Rico over the past few years continue to affect, and hopefully providing solutions and recommendations on how to address these problems that the island of Puerto Rico and its people is facing. Today, we have a number of presentations. We have 5 presentations that will take place in about the span of 45 minutes or so. We are dedicating an hour and a half to this webinar. We have presentations by such noted scholars such as Marinesa Ponte, Roberto Velez, Ariam Cordero, Ibis Garcia, as well as our director, Edwin Melendez, and we will present the agenda briefly. But before doing that, I also wanted to emphasize the fact that this webinar would not be possible without the collaboration and sponsoring efforts by our associates and our co-sponsoring organizations, the National Puerto Rican Agenda, the National Puerto Rican Student Coalition, Idea Común, the Puerto Rican Students Association at NYU, Despierta Boricuas at Yale, and Urbana Planifica. And to all of these co-sponsors, we thank you dearly for the effort involved in this webinar. I also wanted to note that all of the articles, all the presentations made in this webinar today, you can find as part of the special issue of Centro on post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico and local participation. I want to highlight the fact that the Centro Journal has been in continuous publication for 32 years, a great deal of them under the editorial leadership of its editor, Javier Totti, Professor Totti. In this particular issue of the journal, we have the guest editor, who is Edwin Melendez, and he will be giving us a little bit of context shortly on how this volume, the special issue of Centro, came about.
Saludos. The presentations today are part of a collection of studies included in a special issue of the Centro Journal, completely devoted to post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico and local participation. These studies show evidence of how post-disaster recovery is progressing in Puerto Rico, the challenges and opportunities for local participation in reconstruction programs, and the potential of nonprofit organizations, municipalities, and local businesses to contribute to post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico. To date, the available evidence leads to a portrait of an uneven recovery. The nonprofit and business sector had a wide participation in the immediate emergency phase of post-disaster recovery. They were primarily supported by private donations with minimal support from the local or federal government. We also saw a flourishing of grassroots efforts for reconstruction and community resilience, integrating recovery from natural disasters and social reconstruction. But nonprofit and grassroots organizations' efforts are confronted with the challenge of how to build capacity to participate in disaster recovery programs. Their capacity to participate is constrained by the limited experience with housing and economic development and mitigation and resiliency building programs. These programs constitute the bulk of the long-term post-disaster federal economic recovery programs. In these introductory remarks, I discuss the context for understanding the ongoing recovery. First, common indicators of post-disaster recovery found in the literature include the returning of population to the affected areas after natural disasters, the renewal of business activity, and the successful restoration of damaged infrastructure, such as housing, public infrastructure, and government services. In this webinar, we examine empirical indicators associated with these different aspects of recovery. Among these indicators, one key indicator is how much of the federal allocation for disaster recovery have been spent or outlaid. Table 1 of the introduction shows that Puerto Rico received 56.5 billion, or about half of the total allocation of federal funding for disasters in 2017 in the whole nation. Of this total, 36.7 billion, or 65% of the total, has been already obligated or assigned to programs managed by different agencies. Yet, only 16 billion have actually been spent, which account for about 28% of the total allocation. Further examination of the data indicates that 29.4 billion have been assigned to FEMA. About half of this funding, 13.8 billion, have already been spent in public assistance programs corresponding to the emergency phase of recovery. The remaining portion of disaster recovery is devoted to long-term mitigation and infrastructure reconstruction programs. HUD programs target long-term recovery. Of the 19.9 billion allocated by Congress to HUD for CDBG programs, only 3.2 billion have been obligated to specific programs. And of those, only 96 million have been actually spent. Based on a study of CDBG-DR action plans for disaster from 2003 to 2014, conducted by the Urban Institute, program implementation in Puerto Rico is taking twice longer than the typical timeline for other jurisdictions across the whole United States. Community organizations play a critical role in disaster recovery. Nonprofit organizations motivate volunteerism, assess local needs, and distribute goods and aids. However, whether nonprofit organizations will be able and can successfully participate in disaster recovery programs remains an open question. First, the nonprofit sector in Puerto Rico is relatively small, employing about 40,000 employees, or about 4.4% of the civilian population aged 16 and older. By comparison, in the United States, the nonprofit sector constitutes 10% of the workforce. Table 3 of the introduction shows that the nonprofit sector in Puerto Rico comprises about 1,500 organizations registered with the Puerto Rico State Department and 114 co-ops registered with COSEC. Of these 1,600 organizations, 466 were IRS exempt organizations, and this represents the most robust of nonprofits in the island. In 2019, based on 990 returns for calendar year 2018, nonprofits reported $3 billion in total revenues and $7 billion in assets. In comparison to the aforementioned nonprofit sectors, the housing and community development cohort is, with the exception of human services organizations, the weakest subsector, whether measured by average revenues or assets. Community development corporations, or CDCs, are the most ready organizations to participate in recovery programs. This is because they have experience and capacity for housing rehabilitation, reconstruction, and construction. Yet, we identified only 12 CDCs in the island, a very small fraction of all IRS exempt nonprofits. This evidence points to the urgent task of strengthening the CDC infrastructure and to encourage more organizations to undertake community economic development projects in neighborhoods. To conclude, 3 years after 2017 hurricanes, economic, population, and disaster programs indicators offer a picture of an uneven and sluggish recovery in Puerto Rico. The nonprofit sector, with support from philanthropic and local businesses, had a strong initial participation during the emergency phase of recovery, but the island's transition to long-term recovery, which requires implementation of disaster recovery program, has been sluggish and largely lacking engagement of local resources. In sum, nonprofit participation in long-term recovery requires capacity building and inclusive public policy. These are the topics that we will address today.
Thank
Okay.
you, Edwin, for that presentation. As I mentioned before, we are now going to enter into the first set of three presentations this afternoon. We are going to invite the participation of Professors Manuel Lobato, Marta Alvarez, and Marines Aponte, who will be presenting their paper, Entrepreneurial Dynamics in Puerto Rico Before and After Hurricane Maria.
Good afternoon. My name is Marines Aponte. I am going to present the principal ideas of the paper Entrepreneurial Dynamics in Puerto Rico Before and After Hurricane Maria. This paper is co-authored with Dr. Manuel Lobato and Dr. Marta Alvarez. We are also the Puerto Rico Global Entrepreneurship Monitor team. The three of us are full professors at the University of Puerto Rico in the Faculty of Business Administration, Rio Piedras campus. In this paper, we studied the effect of Hurricane Maria on the entrepreneurial activity of the island by comparing important entrepreneurial indicators before and after the event. The research is based on data from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Puerto Rico Community Survey. The analysis is contextualized in a background of the economic policy in Puerto Rico during the last decades and how it turned into a very long recession. Because of time limitations in this presentation, we focus on the GEM indicators and invite you to read the paper for the complete analysis. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, GEM, is the world's leading research project in entrepreneurship. The Adult Population Survey, APS, is delivered to a randomly selected sample of at least 2,000 adults in each country. On the other hand, the National Expert Survey collects the assessment of a group of national experts about factors in the national context that influence entrepreneurial activity in an economy. Before Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico was already perceived by the National Expert Survey as an infertile place for the development of entrepreneurial activity. In 2017, the mean of the scores provided by all Puerto Rico experts were under 5 in a Likert scale from 1 to 9 in all factors except physical infrastructure. This means that the factor's contribution to the promotion of entrepreneurship is considered insufficient. In fact, these negative results have been repeated every year since GEM conducted the first survey in Puerto Rico in 2013, even when the experts change every year. As we know, the hurricane worsened some of the key context factors for entrepreneurship. The infrastructure was strongly affected, and public policy focused on other priorities. To gain a better perspective of the changes, the GEM Puerto Rico team conducted in 2018 the expert survey with individuals that had already participated in the first years, 2013 and 2014. Figure 1 shows the mean results in 2018 in a Likert scale of 5 points compared with the scores given by the same experts in 2013 and 2014. The blue line represents 2018, the orange 2014. As you can see, the difference in the factors that I have highlighted, physical infrastructure, government policies, support and relevance, government entrepreneurship programs, and research and development transfers had lower mean scores in 2018 than in 2014, significance at a 0.05 level. Before continuing with other indicators, we must understand the business phases in the GEM conceptual model. As you can see, the early stage entrepreneurial activity, TEA, includes the nascent and the new entrepreneurial activity. The nascent entrepreneurs are people actively involved in starting a new venture, but still have not received salaries or wages for at least 3 months. On the other hand, the new business ownership rate refers to the proportion of the population that has an active entrepreneurial initiative of less than 3.5 years, that allows them to pay salaries or wages, including to themselves. The established business ownership rate refers to the proportion of the population with an entrepreneurial initiative of more than 3.5 years. Table 5 compares the results of several indicators of entrepreneurial activity in 2017 before the hurricane and 2018 according to the GEM population survey. As you can see, the most important change between 2017 and 2018 is the increase of new business ownership rate from 1.4 to 2.6%. It is also observed that higher proportions of the population identify good opportunities to start an entrepreneurial venture, as well as those who declare their intention to begin a new venture in the next 3 years, from 18.3 in 2017 to 22.9 in 2018, and an increase in opportunity-driven entrepreneurial activity among nascent and new entrepreneurs. The proportion of early entrepreneurs who expect to create more than 5 jobs in the next 5 years also increased from 22.9% in 2017 to 24.2% in 2018. Since the initial population survey conducted by GEM Puerto Rico in 2013, 2018 is the first time that the new business ownership rate is above 2%. Every year, Puerto Rico ranked among the lowest rates of all economies in this indicator. The consequence of repeated very low rates of new business creation is very low numbers in another crucial indicator, the established ownership rate. In Puerto Rico, only 1.6% of the population in 2017 and 1.9% in 2018 own an established business. That is the lowest rate among all GEM participants. The paradox is that Puerto Rico has a high rate of nascent entrepreneurship. In 2017, this rate was 9.5%, and in 2018, it was 9.1%. Why there is such a huge difference in Puerto Rico between nascent and new entrepreneurship rates is yet to be determined, but probably the answer lies in the infertile context and historical economic policies described in the paper. This is a very relevant matter from a public policy perspective and requires further research. Figure 4 shows the dynamics of establishments in Louisiana and Puerto Rico based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics data before and after Hurricanes Katrina and Maria, respectively. As you see in the left, the number of closing establishments jumped in September 2005 in Louisiana, increasing by more than 200% when compared to the numbers of the same quarter of the previous year. In Puerto Rico, at the right, there was also a leap in closing establishment in September 2017, although it peaked in the following quarter. Between March 2018 and March 2019, the number of new establishments was 4,600, which is 100 more, or 28% higher than in the same period, 2016-2017. It is interesting that both Louisiana and Puerto Rico experienced a sudden increase in opening establishments in the quarter following the hurricane impact. In the case of Puerto Rico, the rise of opening establishments lasted longer. Could entrepreneurial resilience represent an important aspect in the reconstruction of economies that suffer unexpected external shocks? This is one of the research questions to be explored. After Hurricane Maria, the entrepreneurial context indicators in Puerto Rico became worse. However, important indicators from the population survey in relation to entrepreneurial activity improved. The first months after the hurricane, the unusual rates of establishment closings stopped and births raised above their average numbers, a similar experience to that in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. It is important to see if this tendency will continue. The rising numbers of new entrepreneurs are encouraging, but they certainly need a proper scenario to prosper.
Thank you for that presentation. We move on now then to our next presentation of the afternoon. We have Centros de Apoyo Mutuo reconfigurando la asistencia en tiempos de desastre by Professors Jacqueline Villarrubia Mendoza, who's an associate professor of sociology at Colgate University, as well as Roberto Perez, also associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the State University of New York in New Paltz.
We want to start off first by thanking Edwin and everyone at Centro for putting together this webinar. So the focus of our talk today is on how Centros de Apoyo Mutuo reconfigure the meaning of assistance in post-Hurricane Maria Puerto Rico. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Maria, community initiatives known as Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, or CAMs, emerged around the archipelago and were central to the processes of assisting impacted communities. CAMs view themselves as decolonial alternatives to traditional models of response and recovery that keep intact power structures, fostering top-down solutions, dependency, and marginalization. By taking advantage of the historical juncture of Hurricane Maria and Puerto Rico's fiscal crisis, CAMs seek to confront existentialism through the strengthening of autogestión and empowerment of marginalized communities. Guided by a critique of traditional notions of assistance and founded on principles cemented in a participatory and inclusive vision of development, CAMs have put into practice a series of organizing exercises to cultivate in residents a vision of community autonomy. An examination of the narratives of the organizers and the initiatives put in place shows us how, through a reconfiguration of assistance, these organizations seek to raise awareness of the limitations of existentialism, involve residents in activities of desarrollo comunitario autogestionado, and demonstrate the benefits of autogestión. So immediately after Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, CAMs were aware that there was a great need to provide assistance to the most impacted communities. CAMs sought to provide assistance based on the creation of participatory democratic practices that focus on the well-being of the collective and empowerment of the subject. The introduction of new relationships between beneficiary and assistance provider initiated a break in the cycle of power and dependency relationships. In other words, CAMs created in the recovery process a model for cultivating new notions about responsibility, the collective, and autonomy through a subversion of the response. This vision of response and recovery to the disaster is also informed by the precarity of a state that has been dismantled and bankrupt by neoliberal policies. In the context of Puerto Rico, these initiatives fill the space left by the welfare state and a recovery process promoted by a neoliberal model, inspiring imaginaries of autogestión and mutual support. According to CAMs, Hurricane Maria provided an ideal juncture to develop a profound social transformation project, given that pre-existing conditions of inequality and precarity were revealed at the same time that an increase in solidarity among neighbors was taking form. In our observations of CAM's community work, we identified 3 practices to cultivate autogestión. First, education as a path to awareness. Second, participation as a source of empowerment. And third, self-sufficiency as the seed for community autonomy. Building autogestión from the ground up is a long-term project as organizers understand the challenge it represents in a society that has only experienced a welfare version of power and development. Our analysis reflects a pattern in which CAMs make extensive use of workshops and educational fairs as part of community support programs. Several CAMs describe their interventions in communities as bifurcated, since they provide some type of resource or service with a complementary workshop, promoting the consideration of the provisions they receive beyond the current situation. The educational processes that occur in CAMs take a diversity of forms and spaces, and also assume that everyone has the power to educate. Our data reflects how CAMs seek to enhance knowledge in different areas, maximizing at all times the use of existing human resources in the community. Under this model, all participating spaces, actions, and people become pedagogical entities that exist in order to transform the community through its own transformation. These learning spaces serve to cultivate a didactic practice on the identification and solution of problems with the goal of producing an awareness of autogestión. In the context of disasters, this social capital is understood as a determining factor in the resilience of a community. So the educated educator subject is fundamental in community development towards a recovery process envisioned from and through autogestión. Another pattern that we see emerge from our observations is how community members are challenged to be agents of change through their involvement in recovery processes. Through processes such as community censuses, calls for ideas, or mutual support commitments, CAMs encourage people to reflect on their needs, develop solutions, and assume responsibilities. Using implicative participation, CAMs seek to produce a commitment towards the collective that takes advantage of the momentum of the solidarity practices that arose as a result of Hurricane Maria. These new social models seek to break with and question the visions of development that go hand in hand with individualism, hierarchies, and the concentration of power outside the communities, and that have produced an unequal experience and response to the disaster. In our fieldwork, we heard from various CAMs that Hurricane Maria removed the veil that hid Puerto Rico's social reality. This revelation, they understand, gave rise to questioning the government's disengagement and failure of its institutions to address it. The revelation for Puerto Ricans of the structural fissures that afflict them led to the beginning of a dialogue on how to better carry projects that enhance empowerment and self-sufficiency. The work of building autogestión questions the validity of the relationship that the state seeks to maintain with citizens by pointing out the negligence that communities face. A critique of power also seeks the cultivation of a decolonizing perspective among communities. Coloniality is understood to be central in the way that disasters and insecurity are experienced in the archipelago. Therefore, listening to experiences of community autonomy is seen as an extension of a decolonizing experience. To conclude, in the response and recovery process from within CAMs, we see initiatives that are not necessarily unique but innovative. What is innovative is the intention of channeling solidarity as a promoter of other processes that address the precarity and vulnerability that precedes and exceeds the disaster. Contrary to assuming solidarity as something of a spontaneous origin and of random impact, organizers understand solidarity as a social force that can be cultivated and intentional. CAMs assume a critical political position, which seeks a radical transformation of the dynamics of power and governance. We understand that it is this approach to criticism action where the novelty and potential of CAM's work towards profound social change resides. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie and Roberto, for that presentation. Following is then a presentation by Dr. Ivis Garcia Zambrano and Dr. Divya Chandrasekhar, who is Ivis Garcia is an assistant professor and Chandrakar is an associate professor in the City and Metropolitan Planning departments at the University of Utah. Their presentation is entitled Impact of Hurricane Maria to the Civic Sector, a Profile on Non-for-Profits in Puerto Rico.
Hello everyone, my name is Ivis Garcia and I am an assistant professor at the University of Utah, and I wrote this paper with Dr. Divya Chandrasekhar, also at the University of Utah, and it's titled Impact of Hurricane Maria to the Civic Sector, a Profile of Nonprofits in Puerto Rico. The rationale of this study is that, as we know, nonprofits are key actors in long-term disaster recovery. But the question is here is, do they have the capacity to provide the recovery services? So what affects recovery capacity of nonprofits after there's a disaster? The goal here is to fit into the capacity building action research of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and IDEA Common. We collected this data on June of 2019, and it was a random sample of phone calls made by Metrica, and 345 nonprofits were selected from a database that we created. The response was actually really good. It was a 68 response rate, or 235 survey responses, and 20 interviews as well. And this is just like a very rough profile of who responded. 99% were incorporated in Puerto Rico, 80% were incorporated at the federal level, which is very important because this is a criteria to be able to receive federal funds. 99% have a board in place. The median year establishment, it was signed in 1996. Median number of employees was 5, which means that most of these nonprofits are small nonprofits. And the median number of board meetings is 6 per year, and 64% directly involve the community members in their operations. So we asked also these questions to see like how connected are these nonprofits to residents, and it seems that they really are, which is also part of the rationale of why nonprofits are so important in terms of recovery. And we found respondents in 46 municipalities. So one of the questions was like, what is your mission? And as you can see here, the majority of the organizations, 24% do human resources, followed by 17% education. Then we have 17% healthcare and religion related. And then we have housing and shelter, community development, and public safety and disaster relief. We asked, how were you affected? 44% of them had damages to their buildings. About 25% had increased demand for services. 7% lost employees. They also lost information and data, among other losses. But here, what I wanted you to pay attention is that there was an increased demand for services. This was very obvious in our interviews. So people that were working in these nonprofits, they themselves had individual needs and family needs. Nonetheless, they were out there in the community helping people, and they had a lot of demand because there was also a lot of need as well. And at the same time, people in these nonprofit organizations were losing employees. Many of them, again, were personally affected or they migrated. So that's another angle of looking at the increased demand. And we asked them, has your mission changed after the disaster? And as you can see, there was changes, but the majority of organizations were involved in disaster preparedness, and now you see a large increase here. We also asked them about their interaction with other organizations, and as you might expect, nonprofit organizations are now communicating more with other local nonprofits, but they're communicating less with government organizations, so at least they feel like there's less interaction, so they're less supported. Similarly, this is true for diaspora organizations, which is not something that we were really expecting. And these are just some of the quotes saying that now there's a lot of networking opportunities and that people have been able to make connections with other nonprofits and plan together. On the other hand, the services and communication with the government have been practically just zero, or they feel that they're not getting the attention that they might deserve, and that there's not a lot of direct communication. We also asked them about grants and whether or not they knew about particular grants and whether or not they apply for them. As you can see, a lot of people know about FEMA or even CDBG home HUD funds, but there's a big gap in the number of people or organizations that have actually applied. Then we asked them, well, how do you hear about information? And the majority is through social media and also the news, but doing web searches and a lot of word of mouth and from different organizations as well. So I just wanted to point out that this is very important in interaction, that a lot of people are communicating through social media and through those networks that they have. We asked well, what do you like to see more of in terms of workshops and opportunities? more information, more technical assistance, training, recovery issues, more social networking, access to data, and advocacy for the mission. And something that we didn't include it was more funding, but of course people did mention it in the category of other. So there was a lot of people that and organizations that were interested in more funding. And as I said, for example, they need great knowledge of how to receive funds from the government. And other people talked about how they were in a position of growing and they needed more resources to be able to have a greater reach. So we asked them specifically about the networking, and 26% of the organizations are engaging in this like networking, and they particularly mention organizations such as the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, Foundation for Puerto Rico, Ayuda Legal, and you have like a list of organizations, including some of them that are not local, like Hispanic Federation, Unidos for Puerto Rico. They are connected, but still about 75% are not connected. So there's the need to reach these organizations so they can increase their capacity and networking. Other people talked about funding and how there was this interest in partnering with organizations in the island, but maybe there's like people from the outside or larger organizations trying to like network with smaller organizations because they had more resident connections, and that they needed to be like careful about those types of partnerships. Something that we found very interesting is that the organizations in Puerto Rico are very dependent from donations from members. So most of these organizations, 45% of their funds are through members, which also implies that many of these organizations are very small organizations, but 32% of them receive like donations from private entities. About 16% of them receive funding from the central government. But again, there's a need for more grant making and for external sources of funding. So as a conclusion, we have found that there's a lot of energy in the nonprofit sector in terms of them changing missions, increasing the demand, having intensified local interaction, particularly among themselves. And they are aware of this, of course, but they want more help with capacity building across the board, from better understanding of technical recovery issues and mitigation to grant writing. So thank you so much. I just wanted to end with this quote. In every agency, there are people who generally want to help, that generally want to see the island recover and to become what it once was, or even better.
Well, thank you to all our presenters in this first set of presentations this afternoon. I will now like to invite our presenters for this first set of papers to engage the audience in a live exchange based on the questions that have been submitted to the Q&A. To begin the conversation rolling, and I'm going to ask the presenters who presented to make their faces live by um, uh, presenting on their video. Thank you, Roberto, um, Marines. Marta, if you can, please join us as well, and Manuel. So I have a number of questions, some of which have already been answered in the Q&A feature, but I nevertheless would like to perhaps expand on some of the answers provided. And to begin, I'm gonna read three questions because I think that they can be answered by all five panelists present. Um, so the first two questions that I'm going to actually present. Yeah, let me do two. What is the role of community involvement from the bottom up, from the ground up, right? So what is the role of the grassroots in post disaster recovery in Puerto Rico? That is one set of questions, and also specifically on business development on the island. Can you speak to the growth of businesses throughout the island? What is the distribution of this growth in businesses throughout the island as a result of in the post-disaster moment? And I think that also a broader question is, uh, some calls for donations or collaborations of the diaspora. I will have a follow-up question to that on the diaspora. But yeah, let's begin with these three questions that I just posed. Adelante.
Well, I can talk about the first one. What is the role of the grassroots? One of them might be just like functional, that for a lot of the grants that are out there and for the CDBGDR, there's like federal protocols that require public participation. And there's a very long history of like people being denied participation and adding that as a very important piece, because that's how plans move forward. You can do a lot of planning, but if people they don't see themselves in the plan, that is a plan that is going to fail. So that's like a second purpose that is not only purely in terms of process, but it's also to make something work. The grassroots has to be involved for that like long-term planning.
Okay. Thank you. Is anybody else would like to also take a stab at this question?
If I can add to, sorry, Marines.
No, okay. Answer yours.
If I can add to the same question on what's the role of grassroots in the recovery process, what we learn is that the Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, for instance, what they've done is to encourage individuals in the communities to engage these processes. We have to acknowledge that for a very long time, the way that policy works is that the policy arrives from the sky into the community, right? The government implements a policy or a project or a program on a community, and the community is just a recipient. And what this process, like Ibis just mentioned, it has an element that requires the participation of the community. Now, if the community has never been exposed to processes of participation in policymaking, that means that they need to somehow be encouraged and invited into the discussion. So many organizations in the grassroots, what done is to encourage individuals and bring information to the communities so the communities can feel and have the tools necessary to actually engage in the process. In some instances, these organizations can also not necessarily serve as the voice of the community, but rather as the ears of the community, so they can bring the information to the community and explain, here is an opportunity for you to actually be part of the process of development in your own places.
Yes.
Thank you, Roberto. Anybody else would like to address?
Yes, the one about the distribution of the business in Puerto Rico. I don't know if Marta or Manuel want to answer this question. Manuel, do you want to answer this one? Or Marta?
Yes, I would like to present. Can I present? I would like to share a graph that maybe is, can I share? Let's see. No. Well,
yeah.
It's okay. I can say about the distribution, we can see that throughout the 8 years that we have been participating in the GEM study, you can see that the TEA, which is the new and the nascent entrepreneurs, has been increasing throughout the years. So there is the intention to create businesses, and then when you see the other survey, which is the expert survey, you can see that there is some problems between the intention of the people to create businesses and the follow-up, right? And there is a big, how do you say, brecha, a gap, big disparity. And so that is the main problem, that here you have the people that have the intention to create different businesses, and then somewhere in the way there are some different troubles, the permits and Manuel and Marines, I don't know if you want to.
Yes, well, I would like to add that I didn't say it, that in the GEM study, the informal business are included. We think that this is really important. And concerning the distribution of the business in the island, although our sample is representative, is a probabilistic sample, and it is representative by region in the island. However, we don't have the specific information about where each business is based. So the sample is geographically representative, but we cannot answer specifically that question about where are the business that we identify in the study.
Just thought something to this. Even though we cannot make that distinction, we can more or less have a profile of the entrepreneur, and we know that young people have a very strong entrepreneurial spirit. When we compare age distribution, we see that most of the entrepreneurial initiatives and activities are concentrated in these people between 25 and 40 years. So that's where the strength is. Therefore, if you think about the distribution of the population, of the age distribution of the population in the different areas of Puerto Rico, you can therefore infer that it might be also a distribution that represents entrepreneurial activity, mostly in the areas where young people are more crowded.
A slightly related question to the distribution of the growth in businesses post-disaster is, can this increase in new businesses in Puerto Rico, does it involve mostly Puerto Rican, or does it involve also foreigners? And I think that implicit in that question is the fear that there may be in some sectors of the Puerto Rican society as to people just trying to profit from Puerto Rico without necessarily building Puerto Rico up.
Well, the sample is from the residents of Puerto Rico. So it has, Manuel put these, is 12%, right, Manuel? Is the percentage of foreign people here in Puerto Rico that lives and have created a new business. So they are residents in Puerto Rico, but it can be the people can be foreigners. Mm-hmm.
I would just want to add that we are working on a very interesting paper that is about transnational diaspora entrepreneurship. And maybe in that work, we can address more closely this theme.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that answer. And actually that ties to and allows me to segue to a somewhat related question that was raised by a member of the audience that talks about donations coming from the diaspora. But I'll expand it and say, what collaborations, what role can the diaspora play in post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico? In engaging local participation in Puerto Rico. It's for anybody who would like.
And I wanted to say, because like in the something I found surprising in one of the questions of the survey of nonprofits, it was that so we asked like the interaction with other nonprofits, and it increased. Government, it decreased. I was hoping to see that the interaction with organizations of the diaspora will increase for nonprofits, but that wasn't the case. It actually decreased. And one possible answer to that is that if you are receiving people in say Chicago, maybe you are like busy doing that. So in the places that people are going, there's like increased participation in there. at the same time, there's an opportunity to, in a way, transnationally being able to create bridges. And there was a question I saw in the chat about how many people have returned. So that would be an interesting question also for thinking about the diaspora and what is happening with people moving there. Are there like some support system in Puerto Rico so they can go back? And so I think that the diaspora has like a big role, but at the same time, it's important to understand that they have a burden of also when people are moving to that particular location.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Ives Garcia. Also, thank you, Professor Roberto Velez and Professors Aponte, Lobato, and Alvarez. We are moving now to the second set of presentations in the second panel. We are going to begin with Ariam Torres Cordero, who is both a central researcher as well as a doctoral student in the urban planning department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And his presentation is What is Possible? Policy Options for Long-Term Disaster Recovery in Puerto Rico.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ariam Torres. I'm a PhD student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm also a visiting professor at the Graduate School of Planning at the University of Puerto Rico at Rio Piedras. And my presentation for today is titled, What is Possible? Policy Options for Long-Term Recovery in Puerto Rico, and I hope you enjoy it. We can often identify unjust outcomes resulting from disaster policies that fail to satisfy basic needs or that underserve disadvantaged populations. What is less clear is how to design and implement successful programs that result in better and more just outcomes. So in search of what is possible, I explored CDBG-DR governance models across different US jurisdictions and examined some of the strategies used. Findings suggest that a great deal can be improved through an equity-oriented interpretation of federal guidelines and the exercise of bureaucratic discretion, and by enabling networks to build local capacity for community and economic development. My research is a comparative case study research of CDBG-DR governance models in Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, and I also include Puerto Rico. Before getting into the case studies, I want to talk about the existing and available models for the use and management of CDBG-DR funds. The Department of Housing and Urban Development allows CDBG-DR recipient governments to establish their own organizational model for designing and implementing recovery programs. These are the direct implementation model, the partnerships model, a method of distribution, or a hybrid option that is basically some sort of combination of these different models. In the direct implementation model, the grantee develops or expands in-house capacity to directly administer the programs in all of the eligible impacted areas. This could be by a direct procurement of contractors to manage or implement specific portions of a program, or by distributing grant administration among peer state agencies or municipal governments. In the partnerships model, the grantee delegates distinct responsibilities or programs to other state agencies, local governments, and/or nonprofits. Finally, the method of distribution allows for subawards to sub-recipient local governments to further define and administer projects and programs at the local level. And the distribution could be through regional differentiation, meaning that certain places are prioritized over others, or that different programs apply to different areas. And the distribution might also be through competitive processes of requests for applications or proposals. It is important to mention that these models are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and grantees can develop a hybrid governance model and combine different approaches. Certainly, when thinking about other US jurisdictions to draw lessons from, it is almost inevitable to examine the case of Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Like Puerto Rico, Louisiana faced many bureaucratic hurdles, mainly due to its lack of administrative and economic capacity and lack of trust from the federal government. In the paper, I go on into some important details about the case of Louisiana after Katrina in 2005, but here I only have time to say that they implemented a hybrid model, but it was a highly centralized and mostly direct implementation. Overall, it is really a great case to draw lessons on what not to do in terms of CDBG-DR governance and the institutionally led recovery process in general. In Puerto Rico, however, we have adopted many of the same practices that Louisiana adopted back then. We have implemented a fairly centralized operational structure and have hired several of the same consulting firms to work on the design of many of the CDBG-DR recovery programs, including the Reconstruction, Rehabilitation, and Relocation, or R3 program. I will not go into the details of the Puerto Rico model here, but I will take this opportunity to comment that the Puerto Rico organizational model is one that, despite being hybrid in that it combines direct implementation and the subrecipient agreement distribution method, it is highly centralized at the state level and shares many similarities precisely with the Louisiana model for Hurricane Katrina. But even in Louisiana, 3 years later, after the 2008 Hurricanes Gustav and Ike, Louisiana determined that it was in their best interest to allow the most impacted local governments acting through subrecipient agreements to decide which recovery programs they wanted to develop to meet their assessed unmet needs. This time, they developed two different methods of distribution, sub-awards to subrecipients and subrecipient agreements through a competitive request for proposals process. So quite a different approach, and as you'll find in my paper, a better one. Let's take a look at the case of South Carolina. In response to the intense flooding left by Hurricane Joaquin in 2015, in addition to the state of South Carolina, there were other grantees of CDBG-DR funds within the state jurisdiction. And these were Richland County, Lexington County, and the City of Columbia. And this is one of the most decentralized cases in CDBG-DR governance. It is almost at the other end of the spectrum when compared to Louisiana post-Katrina case. At the state level, South Carolina adopted a hybrid model, combining the partnerships model with the distribution method. In the case of Richland and Lexington counties, at the local level, they both opted for a direct implementation model. And finally, the City of Columbia also established a hybrid model, combining partnerships to implement some programs and competitive application cycles for others. In the case of Florida, the state opted for the regional differentiation method of distribution. First, it was decided that CDBG-DR funds will be used in counties that suffered the most damage to housing and public infrastructure. In total, 3 classifications were established, Monroe County being the most impacted, statewide counties, and smaller development counties. The interesting thing about Florida case is that the state recognizes that not all areas suffered equally and that some regions need more help than others. So the Presidential Disaster Declaration establishes the areas eligible for CDBG-DR funds, but the state has the ability to prioritize certain areas and set the rules for engagement. Also, although it is the state that manages the programs, instead of adopting a direct implementation model for housing recovery programs, they give local non-governmental entities in each region the opportunity to participate in the process. The next case is Texas after the 2017 Hurricane Harvey. In their preliminary damage assessment, the state identified Harris County and the City of Houston as the most impacted areas and decided to allocate funds directly to both jurisdictions. And along with those funds, they also gave both Harris and Houston the opportunity to plan and determine their organizational model. So Harris County and the City of Houston chose to develop their own local recovery programs and each prepared what is known as a supplemental action plan, which were submitted and subsequently approved as a substantive amendment to the Texas State Action Plan. And what is very interesting about this case is that not only were the most impacted areas prioritized, but they were allowed to lead their own planning processes, where both Harris County and the City of Houston were able to set the housing and infrastructure priorities and engage their local constituents in a more accessible forum. Okay, so what have we learned? Well, for Puerto Rico, as I mentioned earlier, a great deal can be improved through an equity-oriented interpretation of federal guidelines and the exercise of bureaucratic discretion, just like most of the other jurisdictions do, and enable networks to build local capacity for community and economic development. And I don't have time to elaborate much right now, but I do want to mention that within the network enablement, there are 3 important points. First is understanding planning practices and mechanisms used by civic sector groups and organizations. And we all know that the civic sector in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora has done an extraordinary job in terms of recovery, but the question is, how do they do it and what are their preliminary planning practices? Also, it is worth noting that when we talk about the civic sector, we're talking about foundations, housing developers, community-based and grassroots groups. The second point is designing and implementing training and development programs. And here I'm not just talking about job training, I'm talking about popular education and the development of community and organizing and planning skills. And finally, it is important to anchor and build coalitions. It does us no good to have all the federal money for recovery if most of what arrives circles back. There has to be integration and it has to be designed and executed. That is it for my presentation. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to ask me any questions or share any comments you might have.
Thank you very much, Ariam. Following this presentation, we will conclude the 5 presentations that we have for today with the presentation by Edwin Melendez, who is Director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, as well as Professor of Urban Policy and Planning at Hunter College. The title of his presentation is Puerto Rico Community Development Industry's Capacity for Disaster Recovery.
Greetings. Puerto Rico has suffered the compounding effects of multiple disasters since the devastating impacts of Hurricane Irma and Maria in September 2017. Recent disasters have revealed serious vulnerabilities in Puerto Rico: preparedness planning, institutional response capacity and coordination, resource management and various levels of implementation, data availability, and the lack of suitable and accessible mechanisms to support adequate local community engagement. Today, I will focus on 2 key barriers. One, the exclusionary federal and local recovery funding policy. And second, the scarcity of professionals with community development skills and experience with reconstruction programs. So why is it important to understand the role of local nonprofit sector participation in disaster? CDBG-DR Action Plan was approved in early 2018. By the end of 2020, the Puerto Rico Department of Housing has awarded $723 million of contracts to the private sector and $680 million to government agencies and municipalities and to the nonprofit sector. Though at first sight, it seems as a 50-50 split, a closer look reveals the unequal distribution within this program obligations. Of the $723 million allocated to contracts to the private sector for the home repair, reconstruction, and relocation, the so-called R3 program, 63% went to foreign corporations and 38% to local corporations. This program provides assistance for the repair, reconstruction of single-family homes damaged by the hurricanes of 2017. This program provides assistance for the repair, reconstruction of single-family homes damaged by Hurricanes Irma and or Maria. The subrecipients agreements awarded by the Puerto Rican Department of Housing also reveal a skewed allocation, with the lion's share of funding allocated to central government agencies and a paltry portion to municipalities, at least so far. 82% of subrecipients agreements are allocated today to central government agencies, and municipalities are earmarked to receive 5.5%. Nonprofits were allocated 14.7% of subrecipients agreements. Despite the green picture of CDBG-DR allocation supporting program activities implemented by the nonprofit organizations and municipalities, it is important to consider that program implementation is in the initial phase and that a second long-term recovery program, the CDBG mitigation, is actually in the approval stages of the action plan. One of the critical barriers for increased participation of the nonprofits and municipal sectors in disaster recovery is that there are too few professionals with experience in federal economic recovery programs. To ascertain this question, we conducted a survey of the levels of proficiency among professionals in the community development industry for the implementation of post-disaster recovery. The survey established 4 levels of proficiency from minimal to advanced, corresponding to the level of understanding and experience in key competencies for implementing recovery programs. A core finding from the survey of professional skills is that even though self-selection of survey respondents bias results toward the most educated and experienced, there are significant gaps in knowledge to undertake effectively planning and economic development projects in the context of federal programs devoted to reconstruction. Survey participants were highly educated, reflecting a bias towards organizational leaders. Even though, in that context, the survey asked respondents to assess their level of knowledge in a range of competencies that were categorized into 4 encompassing corresponding competencies. There were 4 areas: community planning, that included 8 different types of competencies; social entrepreneurship and economic reconstruction with 6 different competencies; municipal and regional economic development with 6 different competencies, and community and municipal preparation of master plans with 7 different competencies. In general, 73% of respondents identifying the competence in these 4 areas of disaster recovery skills as none or basic, while only 12% of respondents indicated an advanced level of competencies. The silver lining of this finding is that there is a group of professionals that are overseeing programs and implementing recovery projects that can serve as peer mentors to others in the industry. In collaboration with the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship and Community Action, in Spanish, Instituto de Desarrollo Empresarial Acción Comunitaria, Idea Común, Centro developed a sequence of competency-based modules to train community planning and economic recovery professionals. These professionals are facing a new and challenging context, as we have explained. All the presenters in today's panel are among instructors of these courses. These courses evolved into a continuing education certification that is now offered in partnership with the SET of the UPR Arecibo. We are still in the beta phase for many of these courses, and you can go to our website indicated in the graphic to fill an application to serve as a reviewer. Reviewers are invited free of cost to take the courses. The website offers a description of the courses, the instructor bios, and other requirements for the certification. Based on this assessment, I conclude that the potential for nonprofit organizations to contribute to post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico is contingent on 1, reforming public policy, 2, building community development industry capacity, and 3rd, providing professional development for economic recovery. Though I offer more details in the journal article, recommendations include 1, the enactment of local inclusionary policy reforms consistent with federal disaster recovery programs to support decentralization and municipal participation and nonprofit developers and CDC participation. Ariam Torres expanded on this topic. 2nd, the development of a low-cost, high-risk pre-development fund to support existing CDCs with experience in housing and other community development activities, in addition to subsidize pre-development. This is a topic that Ramon Borges addresses in his paper. 3rd, the development of support for nonprofits to become CDCs, the professional development for current staff on housing and community economic development, for understanding federal funding for economic recovery, and for partnerships with established CDCs. These are topics addressed by both Ibis Garcia and Ramon Borges. 4th, the development of professional training for post-disaster economic recovery that will be delivered as comprehensive continuing education courses via outline or structured seminars. And as you saw, we're already working on that. 5th, the strengthening of community development intermediaries to provide technical assistance to nonprofit organizations and developers. In particular, Puerto Rico needs a specialized community development financial institution known for their initials in English, CDFIs, for housing, financing, and development. Here's an area where the co-ops can play a critical role for reconstruction. Thank you so much for your participation in the webinar.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Ariam. I am going to ask now all participants, all panelists rather, to turn on their videos to get into the last set of Q&As. Of course, I am going to target the first set of questions to the last 2 panelists, Ariama Torres and Edwin Melendez. The first question is a little bit more broad. It comes out from the Q&A, and it refers, Edwin, I guess I'll direct this one to you, but any other panelists who would like to tackle it should go ahead. In terms of the revision of funding plans, are they going to change now that the Biden administration has announced the release of funds dedicated to Puerto Rico that had been withheld by the Trump administration? Are there any plans within the government of Puerto Rico to change the spending plans, the funding plans on the island? Will they be increased?
Well, that's a somewhat complicated question, because if you follow the money, so to speak, right, you start with congressional appropriation. That's the $56.5 billion approved for Puerto Rico. That's our Marshall Plan, right? That money has to be translated into programs, and the allocations have to be made by FEMA and HUD, the administration, to those programs, right? Then they have to approve the sort of the programs, the proposals that are based on the plan of action of the Puerto Rico government that Core 3 and Department of Housing propose, right? And I'm explaining this in some detail because we need to understand that even if when the monies are released, what I try to do in the presentation is to say it is funnel, right? To contractors or to government agencies and so forth in different ways. That was Ariane's paper, right? How these things are allocated. When they do the NOFAs, by implication, they're already deciding the policy of who can respond to those grants, okay? That's the problem that Ariane is addressing. Now, let's assume that everything is pro-local organizations, businesses and nonprofits and co-ops and what have you. The problem is that those organizations need to have capacity to implement those programs, right? So it's kind of an iteration of things that create the situation that we are, where monies are not flowing, right? So if the Trump administration prevents money from flowing from HUD and FEMA to Puerto Rico, right, that holds the flow. If when it gets to the Department of Housing or to FEMA, those release funding, right, are not implemented into programs that are inclusive, right, that holds the flow of funding to local organizations. And even when whoever the grantees are or whoever the contractors are get the funding, they can decide to engage local resources or not, and how they engage them, right? So it's sort of a, you need to see it as a continuum. It's a flow of water that can be interrupted in so many places, right? So what we're trying to do from the grassroots up is to empower people to understand that process and to create the organizational capacity to be able to respond to the complexity of these NOFAs, because these are complicated programs, right? So we think there are several strategies that are, right there. One is entering into partnership with organizations that have done these programs and have the experience. There are very few of those in Puerto Rico. So we encourage partnerships with nonprofits in the US, say from the diaspora, that have the capacity and want to do the partnership. We also like to see more partnerships in Puerto Rico between organizations that may have the balance sheet, so to speak, because these programs are complex. You have to do all the work and then you're reimbursed by the government, right? In most of these programs, you need to be a robust organization to be able to implement it. And when you get the money, you need staff that is able to implement these particular projects, right? So it's a complexity. And I think we, the authors here, are looking at this from the ground up perspective, right? So the question is, assuming that we can solve, the Biden administration can solve the flow problem, right? You're still not going to get that funding. Remember, it's like a funnel and it has several ways to go, right? So we need to work at both levels, the policy level, reforming how the monies get to the grassroots, and then the capacity of the grassroots to actually capture this funding. It's our Marshall Plan, but it can be done by outside companies altogether, right? So that's the challenge that we face. The good news is that there are capacities in Puerto Rico, both at the staff level and the organizational level. We just need to harness them, through coalition building, through capacity building, through partnerships, and try to move the movement, the ground up movement, right, from the bottom up, as they used to say, right, to capture this funding. So I'm sorry for the long explanation, but I think it's to the crux of the matter how these different papers come together, right? And by the way, right now, the rehabilitation of housing is being done by nonprofits with charitable, philanthropic, and private sector donations, right? The program that is supposed to do that as of last year, end of last year, reported 26 homes completed out of funding for way many more thousands of housing that they were, given money to do. That's the problem, that local capacity is about efficiency, not just equity, right? It will be more equitable, and we all like to have better distribution, but this is about implementing the programs the right way to have impact, not just in the communities, but to get the work done.
So along those lines, that final part of your answer allows me to segue into another question that specifically speaks to the housing sector. What should the housing sector do to ensure Puerto Rico build back better, and what infrastructure is in place or will be in place to support this direction?
Well, besides what Ariane can talk about the policies for that sector, I will say that there are two things in there. One is the number of CDCs. Both Ramon and I explored that in our papers. There are only about a dozen CDCs. CDCs are the nonprofit organizations that specialize in implementing housing, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and new construction. They are very few, so we have to build their capacity and expand. But the other problem is what IBIS is attending, which is how do you get current nonprofits that have all the potential to be converted into CDCs to actually implement those programs? How do you create the partnerships between the ones that have the know-how, the ones that have the staff that are local, that may have resources and assets to make, to create impetus, right? But I'm going to let the two of them correct me.
Yes, Ariam, go ahead. You had your hand up, I believe.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit to what Edwin was saying, just two things, right? One of the things, the way things are going right now is that each house that's being rehabilitated or reconstructed, it's treated as an individual case rather than seeing like a neighborhood picture or a community vision, right? So that's one thing. Second thing is that those programs that do consider community level interventions or municipal level interventions that are mostly planning programs have yet to start. Right? They haven't started yet. So we're doing housing rehab and reconstruction, but the planning process hasn't been there yet. Right? So there's great disconnection between the reconstruction process and the planning for reconstruction. Right? So addressing that issue is definitely something important in order to build back better.
Okay. Do any other panelists want to?
Yeah, something I wanted to add, to go back to the idea of the CDC. So CDCs have like a mission that is like geographical, and there's a lot of like nonprofits in Puerto Rico that operate in various municipalities, and that doesn't allow them to have like the knowledge or the capacity to put like a vision, as Ariam said, of a particular neighborhood and putting all your efforts in one place. And in terms of the technical assistance, partnerships, as like Edwin says, are very important. So just like the technical assistance comes in the form of actually doing a project that you have never done, but with a bigger organization. And that could be also an outside organization that is like helping you through that process of like building the capacity of like creating housing to a larger scale.
One term that we have heard throughout these presentations that are, underscored in the articles in the volume is this idea of capacity building. What capacity building? What is needed? What needs to be built to provide for the post-disaster reconstruction of Puerto Rico? If you can speak to that on any of the panelists.
Well, part of the sort of the theory behind this is that there are different levels of capacity building. The ground foundation of all that capacity building is the staff, the professional people, whether you're going to do a social enterprise, whether you're going to do syndication of housing, where you're going to do new construction, affordable housing, you need to have staff that is capable of doing this commercial development. The second level is organizational. You can have the staff, but if the organization doesn't have the balance sheet, the track record, the experience, you're not going to get a contract to do 100 units if you haven't done 5 or 10 before you do that. So capacity building for organizations is a gradual, cumulative process, right? Just like small businesses, you're not going to get contracts for 1 million if you haven't had, for 5 million if you haven't done 1 million, and so forth. The third level is, I think, what you can describe as a sort of a sector strategy, right? When you create what we call an advocacy coalition, because to change the policies, no one organization can do it. You really need, you need collective action to influence the way the public think about this, and the influencers that can actually affect public policy. So collaborating and building coalitions, like some of the ones we know in Puerto Rico are emerging, is a very important part. And that strengthening requires that you do a lot of activities and engagements, right, that bring those people together and work on a common agenda, right, that they develop this policy strategy. So anyway, I see it as an interactive process. You don't need to do one at a time and then the other, but they have to go together. Without the policy, you're not going to make this money flow to local organizations, okay? But without the capacity to use them, they're not going to be able to do the programs, right? So you have the needs, but you don't have the know-how. Anyways.
All right. Does any other panelists would like to expand on this question? Hearing none, I will then proceed to the next one. A very interesting question that is very specific. I'm going to try to expand and make it a little bit broader. Is what about population-specific programs? I mean, it is related to the fact that CDCs tend to be geographically specific, but what about population-specific programs? And this is in response to a more narrower question that talks about, are there specific programs targeted to assist Afro-Puerto Ricans throughout the island? And, I know that Roberto, you provided an answer, but can we speak about not just Afro-Puerto Ricans, but, population-specific groups in the island that may benefit from specific programs?
Yeah, I can add to that. So I people have to be able to apply for specific pots of funding. Like, for example, if you're building housing, you have to say, okay, I'm building housing for families, and you need to be able to develop your 2 units, or having 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, right? And that's very different than if you were going to do elderly housing. So I feel that you will have to, in many occasions, specialize in the funding that you have to get, and there's some populations that again might be outside of funding. I hear a lot in Puerto Rico that we like to develop a student housing, right? And that actually is at odds with what the funding that HUD provides. So just being able to understand those things is very important. But in terms of specialization, the idea is you get good at getting this type of money or developing this type of programs, and you can only do that if you do a specialize.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
If I can answer this, there is a program that is being focused on farmers in agriculture, right? And the idea was to support farmers who are involved in ecological or ecological projects, and in a way support also the idea of sustainable agriculture, in addition to sustainable food, right? The access to or reaching some level of food autonomy. And one of the issues that we have been learning about this is that I think Edwin brings this up in the sense that you have people, organizations who are receiving the funding. They are supposed to funnel this funding to the farmers. However, they don't have the capacity to provide that funding to the farmers. And one of these cases is the Science and Technology, the Puerto Rico Science and Technology Trust, that were provided with the funding to manage the farming aspect of these CBG funds, but they don't have any skills or any experience in their history on working with agriculture at all. So now you have small farmers and other organizations struggling to applying for these funds, and the trust does not provide the necessary support for these farmers to reach it. So what we're seeing in the camp level is that many camps who have people with the skills and the knowledge, not only in farming, but on how to understand the application process of this funding, go out there, reach out to the farmers and prepare them to how they can implement, how they can apply for this funding. And again, this is organizations at the base trying to fill in the gap between where the funding is being allocated and the access to that fund.
Thank you, Roberto. And in addition to Roberto, I want to thank all of our panelists this afternoon, Manuel Lobato, Marta Alvarez, Marinesa Ponte, Jacqueline Villarrubia Mendoza, and Roberto again, Iris Garcia Zambrana, Ariam Torres, and of course, Edwin Melendez. I would like you to follow us if you are interested in more of the work that we do at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. You can follow us at centropr.hunter.cuny.edu or connect via Facebook and social media, as well as emails. I would also like to remind you that you will have this presentation available on our website shortly at Nation Builder. And I would also like you to please respond to the survey that you will be receiving shortly on this particular webinar. And again, thank you to all the presenters. Thank you, the audience, for participating. And we will see you soon. Have a good day.